Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Father Dennis Gill, and I am the president of the Society for Catholic Liturgy. And I am very happy that so many of you can be joining us today for this virtual lecture. Our speaker today is Father Uwe Michael Lang, a native of Nuremberg, Germany. He is a Vice-Provost of the Oratory of St. Philip Neri in London. He holds a doctorate in theology from the University of Oxford. He teaches church history at Mater Ecclesiae College, St. Mary's University, Twickenham, and Allen Hall Seminary, London. He is an associate staff member at the Maryvale Institute in Birmingham and on the visiting faculty of the Liturgical Institute at Mundelein, Illinois. He is a corresponding member of the Ner Schülerkreis Joseph Ratzinger, perhaps Benedict XVI, a member of the Council of the Henry Bradshaw Society, a board member of the Society for Catholic Liturgy, and the editor of Antiphon, a journal for liturgical renewal. Now that's a very impressive biography for Father. But most of all, we enjoy him, we enjoy his writings, and we're very happy that he's here today to present this lecture. His lecture will go for about 45 minutes, and then it will be followed by a Q&A. And so, Father, welcome, and we look forward to hearing your presentation.
Thank you very much, Father Gill, for your very kind introduction. And it's good to see quite a few familiar faces I haven't seen for a while. It's a wonderful opportunity to have these lectures in a time when we are still very much limited in what we can do. I hope you can all hear me all right. What I'm going to present to you this afternoon is actually part of a book project I'm working on, and one of the benefits of lockdowns has been that I have been able to concentrate on this project more so than in normal times. A history of the Roman rite of Mass, of the what later came to be known as the Order of Mass. And I'd like to share some thoughts with you about the later medieval period. Standard liturgical textbooks have generally tended to give the later medieval period from about 1200 onwards short shrift. The early Christian Eucharist, which originated as a spirit-filled expression of communal worship, is said to have become an almost exclusively clerical exercise of a hypertrophied ritual system. The formation of national languages and cultures meant that Latin, as the language of the liturgy, became even more removed from the language of the people. Consequently, it is argued, lay participation largely disappeared, including the reception of Holy Communion. The faithful would rather occupy themselves with private, largely visual devotions, while the priest, as the ritual professional, offered Mass at some distance in a language they could not comprehend. This reading fitted into a general narrative of a church in crisis that almost inevitably led to the Protestant Reformation of the 16th century. In recent decades, however, historians have offered new perspectives on Christianity in the later Middle Ages and have highlighted that elements of decline and vitality existed side by side. In liturgical scholarship, the traditional focus on texts has been widened in favor of multidisciplinary studies of late medieval worship from musical, artistic, literary, social, and more generally, religious perspectives. In this talk, I propose to pursue several themes, which in the end will join to offer us a more complete picture of this rich and complex period, namely popular participation, unity and diversity in the development of the Missal, codification of ritual, and, if there is time, transformations in church architecture. And I have a screen to share with you. Modern historiography has habitually depicted the later Middle Ages as an age marked by social decline and cultural exhaustion. as reflected in Johann Huizinger's classic work, The Autumn of the Middle Ages, first published in 1919. You see here the cover page of the first full translation into English, which was published in 1996. That should really be the point of reference, the first full translation of the book originally written in Dutch. Accordingly, medieval religious culture was believed to display a state of accelerating decay and disintegration, which led inexorably to the Protestant Reformation of the 16th century. However, a strong revisionist trend in historical scholarship in the last few decades has questioned long-held positions about the alleged decadence of the late medieval church, and has successfully exposed and challenged teleological narratives that were oriented towards the Reformation. Huizinger's thesis has some factual basis insofar as the late medieval world did suffer a general sense of crisis that threatened its cohesion. Yet this was for a variety of reasons, only some of which were religious. The end of the medieval warm period in the early 14th century had a detrimental effect on agriculture and caused a series of famines. The Black Death, a plague epidemic that raged from 1346 to 1353, wiped out almost half of Europe's population. The long, enervating conflict of the 100 Years' War between England and France from 1337 to 1453 brought a further decline in population and prosperity for both countries. You see now actually some of the Danse Macabre or Dance of Death illustrations that flourished in the later 15th century and are still an echo of the great fragility and vulnerability of life that was experienced throughout the time, especially because of the Black Death. So death comes to everyone, no matter how powerful they are. In 1453, Constantinople was conquered by the Ottoman Turks and the Byzantine Empire fell. The move of the papal court to Avignon in 1309 was a turning point in the history of the papacy and had significant consequences for the Roman liturgy, as will be seen below. The papal schism that followed, 1378 to 1417, deeply affected the church, a few images from the papal palace in Avignon, and generated the conciliarist movement to resolve this acute crisis. Conciliarism favored a more corporate form of ecclesiastical government and placed limits on the Pope's exercise of power, thus attempting to check the claims of the Gregorian reform. The later Middle Ages also brought the growth of the state in the sense of the consolidation and centralization of political authority over a particular geographical area, also described in terms of sovereignty, a term that was coined in the period. As the sense of belonging to a united Christendom headed by the Pope declined among European elites in favor of identification with their own nation, civil rulers began to take greater control over the church in their territories. This was not a golden age of Christianity, as 19th century romantics may have imagined, but it is also mistaken to regard late medieval Europe as almost a mission country, as historians such as Jacques Le Goff and Jean Delumeau have proposed. While belief in magic persisted and certain folk practices could easily be characterized as superstitious, there was a thorough culture from birth to burial. The church was remarkably successful in its primary pastoral role, which is the care of souls, cura animarum. The failings of priests and religious were depicted in contemporary literature, even to the point of caricature. See Giovanni Boccaccio's Decameron, Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales or William Langland's Piers Plowman. However, denunciations of abuses were usually linked with calls for reform in general. The sacramental system and the ordained priesthood as such were not contested, except by the most radical dissidents in the Lollard and Hussite movements. What made the church vulnerable was its secondary role that resulted from the seemingly inseparable entanglement of spiritual and temporal spheres. Renaissance humanism certainly opened up new intellectual and spiritual horizons. While elements of continuity with the medieval world should not be overlooked, the Renaissance introduced a new understanding of man and of the world that saw as its point of reference the legacy of Greek and Roman antiquity. But humanism also aspired to a revival of Christian antiquity, as shown by a renewed interest in the early church fathers, especially the Greek. Christian humanists, above all Erasmus, offered a trenchant critique of contemporary scholastic theology and advocated a return to a simpler theology found in the Bible, read in its original languages, Greek and Hebrew, and the patristic tradition. Religious practice in the later Middle Ages is characterized by diverse, if not contrary, tendencies. On the one hand, historians have been accustomed to claim for this period an internalization of man's relationship to God to such an extent that private forms of devotion came to be regarded as more important than public acts of worship. This tendency developed fully in early modernity through both Protestant and Catholic reform movements. Christopher Dawson has singled out the flowering of mysticism in Spain and Italy, and the ascetic spirituality as represented in the Ignatian spiritual exercises with their roots in the personalism of the Devotio Moderna. On the other hand, more recent scholarship, such as the work of Caroline Walker Bynum, has emphasized the sheer materiality of religious devotion with its focus on miraculous phenomena, relics, and pilgrimages. It would not seem adequate to separate these divergent experiences into the categories of elite and popular piety. Rather, they are found across the social spectrum, as shown, for instance, in the tangible devotion to the holy face of Christ, which was shared equally by the illiterate populace, well-educated nuns, and the powerful Duke of Burgundy. Popular participation. The prevailing use of Latin as a sacred language certainly removed the liturgy from the culture of the vast majority of the lay faithful, but it did not raise an impenetrable barrier to popular participation, as is often assumed. In Roman-speaking countries where the vernacular language developed from Latin, there was a basic understanding, at least of the gist of liturgical texts, contrary to claims advanced by dissident groups such as the Waldensians. The basic meaning of the Mass was accessible even to the lesser educated, at least if they chose to follow attentively, as Augustine Thompson shows in his wonderful study of ordinary religious practice in the Italian cities of the High Middle Ages. Claire Taylor-Jones argues that historians have underestimated the grasp of Latin among women religious in the later medieval period. She exemplifies that with Dominican nuns, a certain degree of Latin comprehension was expected, though not an active command of the language as in the case of the friars. Choir nuns had, or at least were meant to have, a working understanding of the Latin office, which comprised a much wider range of texts than the Mass, including biblical, patristic, homiletic, and hagiographical literature. Hence, Taylor-Jones speaks of a liturgical literacy, especially among the Dominican nuns of the observant reform movement in 15th century Germany. Writing about early modern Europe, Peter Berg records that an increasing part of the laity was studying Latin, including a small but growing group of learned women. The cultural impact of the sacred language in everyday speech is also evident from the resonances of liturgical Latin in vernacular expressions of Roman-speaking countries. The use of Latin in the later medieval and early modern period provided an example of diglossia, which means that it was considered appropriate to use that language in some situations and domains. It was the language of the cultural elites and served to bind together international communities of ideas, above all, the Church and the Republic of Letters. Objections to the use of Latin, not only in the liturgy, but also in other aspects of the Church's life, were advanced by dissident movements and became dominant in the Protestant Reformation. Beyond the Roman-speaking world, comprehension of Latin was limited to a small segment of society. The vernacular prayer of the faithful at the main Sunday Mass in the parish church offered a form of popular participation that corresponded to the needs of the community. The oldest known example of such vernacular prayer from England precedes the Norman conquest and has been dated to the early 11th century. Further examples survive from 12th century Germany, 13th century Italy and France, and 15th century Poland and Spain. Notably, the prayer of the faithful employs local languages such as Castilian, Catalan, Basque, and Breton, as well as Occitan and German dialects. This vernacular rite was inserted at some point during the offertory after the initial Oremus and before the Secreta, and most commonly after the incensation of the gifts and the altar and before the priest's washing of hands, the lavabo. Italian sources stand out for placing the prayer of the faithful after the Sanctus and sometimes even after the Agnus Dei. The priest left the altar and went to the door of the chancel screen or mounted the pulpit. As the English name, bidding of the beads, indicates, the rite consisted in the priest's call to prayer for particular intentions, which would typically include peace, the welfare of the church, especially the Pope, the hierarchy, and all in the service of God, the government of the realm, especially the king or prince, the Holy Land, the bounty of the harvest, merchants and laborers, pregnant women, the sick, pilgrims, perseverance in grace, conversion of sinners, and the faithful departed, especially those related to the local community and those buried in the church's cemetery. The actual prayer could take different forms and usually entailed saying the Our Father and sometimes the Hail Mary once or several times. The commemoration of the dead was more formalized. A recitation of Psalm 129, De Profundis, was followed by a series of short petitions and a concluding collect. Either before or after the prayer, the priest announced the liturgical feasts of the coming week. In French sources from the 15th century onwards, the vernacular rite known as prône included not only the prayer of the faithful, but also the publication of indulgences, bans of marriage, and excommunications. And in the early modern period, prône became an important place of catechesis. So far, this discussion of popular participation in the late medieval Mass has been concerned with language comprehension. This initial focus is legitimate insofar as the Church's public worship is ordered by official texts. At the same time, however, we need to be aware of a narrowing tendency in 20th century liturgical scholarship and renewal that sees liturgy only as text and limits participation to speaking roles. Thus, Frank Senn has proposed a broader conception of liturgical participation. I quote, "The laity participation not. They have always derived meaning from the liturgy, whether it was the intended meaning or not. Furthermore, the laity in worship was surrounded by other vernaculars than language, not least of which were the church buildings themselves and the liturgical art that decorated them." End of quotation. Senn's vernaculars are echoed in the work of Eric Palazzo, who has explored the sensory dimensions of the liturgy. The stimulation of seeing, hearing, smelling, touching, and tasting made participation in the Mass a synesthetic experience. The research project, Experience of Worship in Late Medieval Cathedral and Parish Church, initiated by Bangor University in the UK from 2009 to 2013, has aimed at recreating such a synesthetic experience through liturgical enactment. For this purpose, the material conditions for the celebration of Mass in late medieval English settings, including buildings, objects, and texts, were carefully reconstructed. The subsequent analysis and interpretation of the participants' engagement with the ritual offers a lively complement to the new perspectives offered by historical study. And the image you see is one of these reconstructed Masses in a well, parish setting or in the setting of a small church. This is actually a late medieval parish church whose rood screen was preserved. So you have an idea how it would look. And you see the participants actually dressed up for the occasion to enter into the experience. And the Mass was, as it were, recreated. Also the material conditions, the objects were very carefully actually made to resemble what would have been used at the time. So it's a very interesting project, actually. So first you had the Mass in a parish setting, and then you have the setting in Salisbury Cathedral, the Mass of the Holy Name of Jesus in Salisbury Cathedral, with quite a large schola and more elaborate setting. It remains true that the laity's participation in the Mass was at a remove from the action of the officiating priest, even where lay devotion was literate, as was increasingly the case in the later medieval period, especially with the invention of printing. There was a clear separation between clergy and the faithful. Primers and other devotional books did not contain translations of the Latin liturgical texts, but rather offered spiritual and moral commentary on the Mass. Lay participation was by its very nature untexted and unscripted. It was not regulated by the official liturgical books that gave detailed instructions to the clergy regarding what to say and how to perform the sacred rites. Thus, the faithful were able to engage with the Mass in a variety of ways that are not easy for us to grasp, precisely because they were not scripted. Paul Barnwell, as part of that Experience of Worship project, speaks of the meditative and affective nature of much lay devotion in the period. The sensory dimensions of the late medieval liturgy offered important stimuli for such meditation. The images on the rood screen and on the walls of the church visualized the communion of the saints, while funeral monuments were a reminder of purgatory and the need to pray for the dead. The faithful who attended Mass weekly, and many of them daily, would be familiar with the stable chants of the ordinary. Barnwell concludes that keywords and phrases would easily be recognized. Their significance would be apprehended even if they were not understood in the way necessary to translate them. It is worth noting here that the laity would have found the parish Mass celebrated at the high altar less approachable, since they were at considerable physical distance from the priest, and their view was restricted not only by the rood screen, such as here, but also by service and singers in the chancel. So-called private masses at a side altar or in a chantry chapel offered a more direct way for the faithful to engage with the liturgical action both visually and orally, and this contributed to their popularity. Woodcut illustrations of the Mass in moral and devotional literature from the late 15th and early 16th century show laymen and women in close proximity to the priest at a side altar of the church. This here is from a moral a book which warns against chatting, gossiping during the celebration of Mass, and shows actually a group of women here at close proximity, really, to the side altar where Mass is offered. An important element that distinguished the laity's participation in the Mass in the period under discussion was the scarcity of fixed seating. For most of the Middle Ages, people usually stood or knelt in the nave, with men and women separated and aligned according to social rank. Hence, there was an, albeit restricted, freedom to move within the church building. Seating was provided for the elderly and infirm members of the congregation in the form of ledges at the walls of the nave or portable stools. It is commonly held that fixed benches began to appear in Northern and Western Europe in the 13th century and became more widespread from the late 14th century onwards. Retracing the history of church benches is beset with intractable difficulties for lack of material evidence. Early examples of wooden benches or pews are likely to have been replaced, either because they were worn out or because more elaborate ones were produced. Late medieval benches have survived above all in English parish churches, while examples from continental Europe are rare. The reasons for this discrepancy are not clear. However, written sources confirm that fixed seating in churches spread in the territory of the Holy Roman Empire from the 14th century as well. A permanent seat could be purchased. This became an expression of social status and occasionally social conflict. The development of fixed benches in churches is usually associated with an increased frequency of preaching in the late medieval period. Barnwell argues that this was only one factor among others and points to the flourishing of meditative piety in the period, which focused on the crucified Christ visible on the monumental rood screen, a focus sharpened by the installation of permanent seating. The sitting was associated with the contemplative life, and this is illustrated from contemporary iconography of the Annunciation, which often shows Mary seated in prayerful reading. At any rate, the increasing presence of benches and pews changed the dynamic of the congregation, at least in the part of the nave closest to the chancel. The vernaculars other than language of the late medieval Mass, evoked by Sen, spoke eloquently to worshippers, both as private individuals and in a juxtaposition typical of the religious practice of the age as a body. The social anthropologist Mary Douglas has spoken of non-verbal symbols, which are capable of creating a structure of meanings in which individuals can relate to one another and realize their own ultimate purposes. To quote an influential essay by the historian John Bossy, the Mass was a social institution and created a bond that was not only expressed verbally through praying for one another, see my previous comments on the bidding of the beads, but became tangible in two particular rites, the Pax and Blessed Bread. The kiss of peace was exchanged by means of the Pax, also known as the Pax Breed or Pacificale, a tablet made of glass, wood, or metal, and often adorned with an image of the crucifixion or the Lamb of God. You have a German example with an image of the crucifixion. The Pax was passed from the clergy to the laity and was kissed in turn. A particular custom on Sundays and feast days was the blessing of bread that had been prepared and offered by the women of a household in the village or a neighborhood in the city, organized by rota. After the Mass, the priest blessed the bread and it was distributed to the congregation. Some of the blessed bread, or holy loaf in English sources, was taken to the sick and the elderly, and people kept it because they believed in its protective powers. Both the Pax and the Blessed Bread were obvious substitutes for sacramental communion, which had become rare in parish life, and for most lay people, it did not extend beyond the annual reception at Easter as prescribed by the Fourth Lateran Council. However, these particular rites contributed significantly to the community building power of the Mass, which Augustine Thomson describes with a view of the medieval city-state, the comune of northern Italy, quote, celebration of Mass, especially Sunday Mass, sealed the unity of a community or neighborhood. This ritual created and vivified the community. The Mass was its very life, as the midday meal was the life of the family. End of quotation. My next topic is the ideological foundation for the unification of the liturgy emerged from the papal reform movement of the 11th century, especially with the pontificate of Pope Gregory VII. However, general conformity with Roman liturgical practice began to be achieved only with the rapid expansion of the new Franciscan order in the 13th century. The Friars Minor settled on the Missal and Breviary of the Roman Rite in the form used by the papal curia. These books were simplified by comparison with the fuller ceremonial observed in the major churches of Rome, especially the Lateran Basilica, the Pope's Cathedral. Thus, the later Middle Ages witnessed a standardization of the Latin liturgy according to the Roman model, which increasingly shaped local diocesan uses. While episcopal and monastic centers throughout Europe shaped and retained their particular liturgical customs within the Roman tradition, a movement towards unifying the rite of Mass can also be observed on a regional level, as in the case of the Sarum use. Despite such tendencies towards standardization, variations in the missals of dioceses and religious orders remained and were significant in certain respects. In the formal presentation of liturgical formularies, such as the headings of the Mass propers, in the prayers, readings, and chants assigned to feast, in the sanctual cycle of the calendar, and in the structure and sequence of parts within the missal. Even where the order of Mass essentially followed the use of the Roman curia, ordo missali secundum consuetudinem Romanae curiae is a common phrase used in these books, there were differences in the texts and rubrics of the introductory and the concluding rites. Likewise, the ritual shape and the prayers of the offertory were by no means uniform. Liturgical diversification increased with the addition of new saints' feasts, the proliferation of prefaces, tropes, and sequences of uneven quality, and the multiplication of votive masses, some of which were attached to questionable practices, such as the use of a symbolic number of candles for specific masses, 7 for the Mass of Saint Sophia, along with 7 orations, 12 for the Apostles, and 24 for the elders of the Apocalypse. In general, diocesan bishops did not have effective control over the making of liturgical books in their territories. Before the invention of printing, manuscripts for liturgical use were usually copied at the initiative of local churches and their clergy, who would engage scribes for this particular purpose. Local nobility or other patrons would often donate missals and be involved in their production. The new, fast-growing and unregulated printing industry dramatically simplified the production of liturgical books and gave printers an important role in this process. Leaving aside the stable parts, above all in the order of Mass and the temporal cycle of the liturgical year, the actual composition of a diocesan missal seems to have been to a considerable extent in the hands of the printers themselves, as the eminent historian of the Catholic Reform and Counter-Reformation, Hubert Jedi, noted. Rather than leading towards uniformity, the possibility of printing missals introduced, at least initially, an even greater diversity. Amato Pietro Frutas has drawn attention to the categorical differences in the sanctual calendars of the early printed editions of the Missale Romanum from the last quarter of the 15th century, most of them coming from Italy. The Editio Princeps, printed by Antonio Zarotto in Milan in 1474, simply lists a saint or a group of saints for each day of the year, in a manner resembling the martyrology. Other early printed missals use a version of the Franciscan calendar with a motley addition of saints. Some bishops denounced this rank growth, as well as the errors introduced by careless printers. A particular problem concerned rubrics, which did not have official character and varied both in quality and in usefulness. Hence, some bishops, actually mainly in the Holy Roman Empire, took the initiative to create officially approved printed editions for liturgical use. Episcopal commissions of liturgical books reached their height in the last decade of the 15th century and then fell sharply in most dioceses. The reasons for this fluctuation are complex, and they probably include a saturation of the market as a result of the success of the earlier initiatives. Liturgical books, once acquired, continued to be used as long as they remained in adequate condition. Going beyond such pragmatic motives, however, disagreements between reformers who inclined towards corrected edition of the current liturgical books and humanists who argued for a further ranging reform, returning to ideals of Christian antiquity, may have stifled the bishop's efforts in overseeing the publication of liturgical books. Codification of ritual. The urban stational liturgy, which had in many ways shaped the development of the Roman Mass, fell into decline in the 12th and 13th centuries when popes began to turn away from the city and the papal curia frequently moved between central Italian towns such as Orvieto, Viterbo, and Anagni. The preferred place for papal celebrations was no longer the city with its basilicas and titular churches and the processional spaces between them, but the chapel of the palace. The simplified ritual observed in the court setting became the model for the Roman liturgical books promoted in the 13th century by the rapidly expanding Franciscan order. The transfer of the papacy to Avignon in 1309 brought the cycle of stational liturgies in Rome to a definitive halt. In Avignon, we saw the palace, papal liturgical celebrations were also held precisely in the setting of the palace. Even after the return of the Pope to Rome in 1378 and the end of the Western Schism in 1417, the intimate link of the papal liturgy with the urban churches of Rome was never resumed. The Vatican Palace became the Pope's preferred residence, and major liturgical celebrations were held in its great chapel, Capella Magna, known as the Sistine Chapel, since its rebuilding under Pope Sixtus V, who reigned from 1471 to 1484. As the conciliarist movement diminished because of its failure to deliver its stated program of renewing the church in head and members, the papacy regained momentum, and its liturgical celebrations once again began to be imitated by bishops throughout the Latin Church. In the late 15th and early 16th century, the papal masters of ceremonies, Agostino Patrizi Piccolomini, who died in 1495, Johann Burckhardt, who died in 1506, and Pari de Grassi, also referred to by his Latinized name, Paris de Grassis, who died in 1528, were responsible for organizing and recording both liturgy and court ceremonial. They left us three categories of written works: prescriptive ceremonial books, descriptive diaries, and treatises. These sources offer us not only detailed accounts of papal and curial liturgies, but also insight into the life at the papal court in the Renaissance period. For musicologists, the close relationship between music and ritual in the Sistine Chapel is of particular interest. The Ceremoniale Romanum, composed in 1488 for the papal curia by Patrizi with the assistance of Burckhardt, offered a model that was increasingly adopted by cardinals who served as diocesan bishops outside Rome for their own celebrations. And so once again, the Roman model was adopted more and more widely throughout the church in Europe. The papal masters of ceremonies of the Renaissance period were working in a tradition that can be traced back to the Ordines Romani of the early medieval period. From the late 13th century onwards, these ceremonial instructions became more systematic and more specific, and they had considerable impact beyond their immediate purpose throughout the Latin Church. Care for precise ceremonial instruction found a visual expression in a series of diagrams inserted into a late 14th century processional, which represents an adaptation of the Sarum used for the Diocese of Norwich. So we're leaving Rome for a moment, but I just wanted to show these rather wonderful diagrams, which are quite unique, but certainly illustrate the importance that was attributed to ceremonies and the sort of correct and orderly carrying out of ceremonies. The manuscript was in all likelihood produced for the community of chaplains at the Hospital of St. Giles, also known as the Great Hospital in Norwich in East Anglia. 9 diagrams, of which were unique in the liturgical year and hence required special preparation, especially those in Holy Week and on Easter Day. The liturgical ministers are identified by signs that indicate their role, such as a thurible, processional cross, or pair of candlesticks. A tonsured head, small white circle surrounded by a thick circle of hair, marks the priest, the deacon, and the subdeacon. The celebrant is usually shown by a stylized cope. For particular ceremonies, material objects are on display, such as the Paschal candle. Here, that's from the Easter Vigil, the baptismal font, or vessels for the holy oils. These illustrations are the earliest of their kind and do not seem to have been imitated until the 16th century, when similar diagrams appear in printed sarum processionals in the form of woodcuts. Francis Warmold, who owned the manuscript and first drew attention to the diagrams, notes their unique character in comparison with the figurative depictions of ceremonies found in deluxe pontificals and coronation books. Quote, "These are idealized representations and are quite distinct from the more utilitarian diagrams of our manuscripts, which record the exact positions of those in the procession at certain specified points in the ceremony," end of quote. And Warmold suggests that the diagrams grew out of the roster or tabula on which were set out day by day the various liturgical duties of the clerical community. So you sometimes see depictions of liturgical celebrations in medieval manuscripts, but they are idealized depictions. Bishop in a magnificent attire conducting some ceremony. They're not meant as an exact representation of what was actually happening. These diagrams are actually meant to teach you what you're supposed to do. I have not explored this, but it would be worth trying to find out whether Adrian Fortescue, when he wrote the Ceremonies of the Roman Rite, actually knew of this manuscript and was inspired by his own by this type of diagram for his own diagrams he used in the Ceremonies of the Roman Rite. Now this really forms the backdrop of increasing concern for precise performance of liturgical ceremonial. And against this backdrop emerges the work that was to become decisive for the further development of the ritual shape of the Roman Mass, which is the Ordo Missae of Johann Burchard. The first edition of this work is actually from 1496. It is presented as an order to be observed by a priest in the celebration of Mass without chant and without ministers, according to the rite of the Holy Roman Church. This was compiled for the purpose of the instruction of newly ordained priests. There's a reprint from 1498, which is largely identical with its predecessor, except for a few minor additions. And there's a second edition of 1502, which was printed with a letter of approval from Pope Alexander VI. This second edition is much broader in scope than its predecessor. Burchard insists that its ceremonial instructions also apply to cardinals and prelates, including the Supreme Pontiff, when they celebrate Mass not pontifically but in private. This Ordo Missae of 1502 was widely received, was published in an Italian translation in 1534, and was inserted into some printed editions of the Missale Romanum from 1541. Burchard thoroughly reworked his earlier order for the new edition, which offers much more detailed and comprehensive rubrical instructions. Now, the ritual performance of gestures and movements is precisely regulated and meticulously explained. By contrast, the Ordinarium Missa, named after its incipit Paratus Sacerdos, which was integrated into the Roman Missal and contained the recurring parts of the rite, was largely limited to prayer texts and only had room for very few rubrics. But when you look at Burchard, you have extremely detailed instructions for how to fold your hands, how to comport yourself, what gestures to adopt in the celebration of Mass. In this sense, Burchard's order can be best understood in continuity with the Franciscan ordinal Indutus Planeta from 1243, which had a very important influence on the way the Roman Mass was celebrated ever on. Now, Burchard follows the use of the Roman Curia with some important specifications. Just to name a few key examples, in the introductory rites, Psalm 42, Judica Me, is recited at the foot of the altar. That was the Roman practice since Indutus Planeta, But in some diocesan uses, the psalm was actually prayed in the sacristy or in procession to the sanctuary. Burckhardt specified it is to be prayed at the foot of the altar. Secondly, the offertory is fixed in its curial form. The 1502 order, however, has an offertory procession, which still had some currency at the time, which did not make it into the Tridentine Missal. After reading the offertory verse, the celebrant goes to the epistle side of the altar, removes his maniple, and accepts the undetermined gifts from the faithful, who each kiss his hand. Then the celebrant responds by saying either, "May your sacrifice be acceptable to Almighty God," or "May you receive 100-fold and possess eternal life." Somewhat citation with a loose citation of Matthew 19:29. Again, a point I never explored, but maybe it would be worthwhile to investigate whether the scriptural quotations at this point, the scriptural sentences in the Book of Common Prayer, in the Anglican Book of Common Prayer, are somehow indebted to this practice of the offertory procession, which presumably had a certain currency at the time. The third key example where Burckhardt was actually decisive in forming the shape of the Roman Mass was in the concluding rites. Burckhardt stipulates that the final blessing follows after the prayer, Placia tibi sancta Trinitas, and not vice versa, as was the use in some diocesan missals and also in some early printed missals. The last gospel, the prologue of John's Gospel, is included in Burckhardt's order, and it is to be read at the altar rather than to be said in a low voice from memory as the celebrant returns to the sacristy, which was the practice in the Roman Pontifical High Mass and in some diocesan uses. The rationale for this particular change may have been to focus on the sacred texts and its authentic meaning and to avoid a perfunctory recitation of it. But perhaps the most significant innovation in Burckhardt's order concerns the reverential gesture for the consecrated Eucharist. Namely, when the celebrant has pronounced the dominical words over the bread, he is instructed to genuflect as a sign of adoration. Genuflexus eam adorat. Then he elevates the consecrated host, and after having placed it on the corporal again, he genuflects a second time. In the same manner, the consecration of the chalice is followed by a genuflection before and after the elevation. The genuflection replaces the medium bow that is indicated in Indutus Planeta for the adoration of the body of the Lord. Until the later Middle Ages, bowing towards the consecrated species remained the priest's liturgical gesture of adoration, while kneeling in the presence of the sacrament was a characteristic expression of lay piety. Now, some priests in Germany introduced a genuflection on both knees after the words of consecration, but this appeared impractical in the ritual setting of the Mass. Peter Brove, German Jesuit liturgical scholar, whose work has really been rediscovered more recently, thanks to an collected edition of his scattered contributions, really one of the most interesting liturgical historians from Germany in the 20th century. So Peter Brove surmises that there was a reticence to adopt the short genuflection on one knee only, either because it could be interpreted as an act. Nonetheless, the new practice was gaining currency in the late 15th and early 16th century. Burckhardt's Order 1502 systematically stipulates genuflections not only for the double consecration of bread and wine, but also in subsequent moments of the rite when a sign of reference to the body and blood of Christ is called for, when the priest uncovers or covers the chalice with the pall, and when he takes the consecrated host. I have to pass over the section on the Mass and sacred polyphony, but hopefully one day you will be able to read about this. What I would like to consider finally are transformations in church architecture. The typical interior of a late medieval church was not conceived as a unified space, but was structured by a complex system of limits and barriers. While the Western Church never went as far as the Byzantine tradition, which introduced an iconostasis that separates the sanctuary completely from the nave, screens in Cyboria served to emphasize the sacredness of the high altar. While such structures impeded the view of the laity, they also engaged their devotion by appealing to a mystical reality. From the late 12th century, a rood screen, Joubert in French and Lettner in German, was installed in larger churches to divide the chancel with the high altar from the nave. An example from Albi Cathedral with this very ornate, sort of quite late medieval rood screen. Cathedral, collegiate, and monastic churches generally had an altar in front of the rood screen where masses were offered for the laity. Example of Meissen Cathedral, the medieval cathedral of Meissen in Germany, which later became Protestant, which meant the rood screen was preserved in Catholic cathedrals, was then often removed in the Tridentine Reform. And there you actually see this altar in front of the rood screen, known in Germany as altar of the laity, Laienaltar, or altar of the cross, Kreuzaltar. Side altars and enclosed chapels added to the liminal zones within the edifice, and the crossing of such a threshold, a limen in Latin, was associated with a particular ritual. For instance, entrance to the body of the church by the sacrament of baptism, and access to the altar by the sacrament of holy orders. The late medieval winged altarpiece, which could be opened and closed, as well as veiled with lateral curtains or with a lantern cloth, highlighted the altar as the liminal sphere par excellence that creates a passage between heaven and earth by means of the Eucharistic sacrifice. Textile furnishings had no liturgical function in Western tradition, but were employed to conceal and reveal distinct sacred spaces within the building. Moreover, decorated curtains had their own iconography and so offered forms of visual participation to the faithful. Moreover, in the 14th and 15th centuries, two particular focal points were added in churches north of the Alps. A monumental Sacramentshaus, a sacrament house in the chancel for the reservation of the Eucharist. See a very splendid example from the magnificent parish church of St. Lawrence in Nuremberg, Germany. And another important element, an elevated and often ornate pulpit made of wood or stone in the nave, usually on the gospel side, in keeping with the late medieval emphasis on preaching. It's another subject we could really pursue, the importance of preaching in late medieval Europe. Around the time, so 15th century, really, starting in Italy, new architectural ideas were to have significant consequences for the performance and experience of the sacred liturgy. Renaissance architecture transformed the typical church interior by creating a unified space. It was an unobstructed view of the main sanctuary from the nave, with its focal point on the high altar and increasingly on the reserved Eucharist. The introduction of a fixed tabernacle on the high altar is usually associated with the liturgical reforms that were implemented after the Council of Trent. However, this practice was already promoted by reforming bishops before Trent and can be traced back to 15th century Tuscany. High altar tabernacles were introduced in several churches of this Italian region, including the cathedrals of Volterra, 1471, and Prato, 1487. Perhaps the best known example is the splendid bronze tabernacle made between 1467 and 1472 by Vecchietta for the high altar of the Church of Santa Maria della Scala Hospital in Siena, which was then transferred to Siena Cathedral in 1506, where it replaced Duccio's Maestà, so that magnificent painting by Duccio, which is now exhibited, I think, in one of the museums of the city, possibly the town hall, had its place on the high altar of Siena Cathedral and was replaced by the bronze ciborium tabernacle by Vecchietta. The unified church interior gave the liturgical rites in the sanctuary greater visibility, and so enhanced their potential for engaging the congregation. At the same time, the pastoral functions of the nave as the place of preaching and of sacramental confession were brought into greater relief. Such transformations would come to full fruition in the post-Tridentine. Come to my conclusion. The approaches to the liturgy of the Mass in the later Middle Ages that I have pursued do not yield a homogeneous picture. The period is marked by complex and diverse phenomena. A personal and reflective faith is, as it is epitomized in the Devotio Moderna movement, exists alongside a flourishing religious practice centered on the tangible and material. The Ordo Missae, after the model of the Roman Curia, is widely adopted throughout the Western Church, while increasingly detailed rubrication supports a standardized form of celebrating Mass. At the same time, a variety of diocesan and religious uses persists, and liturgical texts are composed locally, especially for votive Masses that arise from particular devotions, such as the Holy Face of Christ. The laity's experience of the liturgy was clearly separate from that of the officiating clergy, not least because of the use of Latin as a sacred language. Nonetheless, forms of popular participation were offered not only by verbal elements, such as the vernacular prayer of the faithful, but also by non-verbal symbols, such as the pax, that spoke powerfully to the faithful and made the Mass a social institution that was deeply rooted in the people's cycle of life. There were aspects of the Church's role in society that made it vulnerable and called for reform, but the sacramental system and its liturgical expression proved to be remarkably resilient. Thank you very much.
All right, everyone. Thanks so much. Now we have time for questions and comments. You can feel free to unmute yourself and sort of ask the question directly. We'll have about 15 minutes.
Father Lang.
Oh,
yes.
Father Lang. Father Kosick here. Hello.
Hello.
Hello. I lost the audio briefly when you were talking about the introduction of the rubric to genuflect immediately after the consecration of the elements. You mentioned there was some reticence about that, and I lost the reason for that.
Oh, yes. Well, that's actually according to the Jesuit liturgical historian Peter Brove from the early 20th century, who has a very remarkable series of studies actually on that period. And Brove suggests that the reticence came either from a sense that actually implied a lack of reverence. Genuflection on one knee implied a lack of reverence. Try to make a double genuflection after the consecration, which is of course not very practical. And the other suggestion he has is that there was reticence because it was used in court ceremonial. So a single genuflection was common in court ceremonial, and hence it was not considered appropriate for, well, the veneration of the body and blood of Christ in the Mass.
It was deemed too secular.
In a way, yes, yes. And certainly in the liturgical gesture, until Burkhard was the bow, the priest's liturgical gesture. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Mhm. Mhm.
Which you still have in the Dominican Rite, for instance. We have seen that at some point.
I believe Robert wants to ask a question.
Oh, yes. Can you hear me, Father? Thank you so much for this illuminative presentation. The prayer of the faithful was in the vernacular. Was the preaching generally in the vernacular during this time, or did it vary from place to place, sometimes in Latin, sometimes in the vernacular?
Well, preaching was certainly in the vernacular, and ever since the Fourth Lateran Council, there was a great emphasis on preaching. And in fact, historians speak of the pastoral turn of Lateran IV. So in the later Middle Ages, a parish priest throughout Europe would be expected to preach on a Sunday in the vernacular. Maybe not all took that obligation seriously enough, but certainly preaching was very widely done. And yes, it was in the vernacular. So it's one of these sort of Reformation stereotypes that really historians have dismantled. In that the Word of God was never preached in later Middle Ages. No, it was actually preaching was actually something that was quite popular among the people. Of course, what was most popular was the preaching of religious, like Dominicans, who were particularly called to preach, but certainly it was also preaching in the liturgical setting. It was either after the gospel, actually after the creed, that you had a sermon. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for a wonderful talk. I've seen examples in the late Middle Ages in Austria of priests preaching every day at Vespers and stipends being accepted for it.
Oh,
I've also seen cases, I don't know if it was late Middle Ages or more like 13th century, of homilies at Mass in Latin in a monastic setting. And apparently, they were conversant in it.
yes, thank you. I'm sure there was Latin preaching as well, but I think it was in a setting where the audience was meant to understand it. Yeah, but again, if you look at the Anglican custom of preaching at evensong, again, this is I haven't verified that, but that could very well be just a continuity of an older custom that perhaps the preaching was on Sunday afternoon rather than at the Mass in the morning.
Father Bradley.
Well, Michael, thanks very much for a splendid talk. I was really taken with this idea of the chancel screen and it really being not so much a barrier to participation, but a means of participation. And this is something that comes out in there's a new book, which is a collection of essays from a conference of the Ecclesiological Society in England. And this is a theme that comes through. They're talking about chancel screens after the Reformation and the encouragement to preserve chancel screens in Anglicanism after the Reformation in England. So I think this is very interesting, and particularly the connection with the bidding prayers, the pulpitum of the chancel screen being a place both for preaching, but also for, as you said, the bidding of the beads and things. So I'm very taken with that, and I'd like to thank you for that. I have just one brief question. When you spoke about the printing of liturgical books and the unregulated way in which that took place, often there's a characterization, maybe even a caricature, that the centralization of the liturgy at the Council of Trent and afterwards was, in a sense, taking away authority from bishops and centralizing this authority. Does this suggest perhaps that this is a more positive act, that it is in a sense helping bishops because they're not able to control these things themselves, and so bringing things more central?
Yes, that's a good point. I think you could see it from that perspective. But you have examples of late medieval bishops trying to control the production of liturgical books in their diocese and not being very successful. Actually, Nicholas Cusanus, as Bishop of Brixen in South Tyrol, tried to produce sort of normative manuscripts, corrected liturgical manuscripts twice at two diocesan synods in order to standardize the celebration of the Mass in his diocese, but failed. He said some bishops took the initiative, and you have these early printed missals with an episcopal authorization, but there are many editions without such authorization. So I think that often the printers took the initiative. Perhaps local clergy got involved, advised the printers and on which votive masses to include and that sort of thing. But the bishop was really, there was no episcopal authority involved. So it's quite possible that also many bishops were happy to grant the Holy See the sort of control over liturgical books. Also at Trent itself, actually, the proposal to edit sort of standard liturgical books came from the bishops from various parts of Europe, Spain, Portugal, Italy. So yes, I think that's a good point.
Father Lang, Father Sean Tunick, question about the exchange of the peace using the Pax board and how that might affect here in COVID times. We have largely abstained from offering the sign of peace. I wondered, it seemed what you're saying is that the use of the Pax board and passing the peace around the laity became a way of perhaps participation when communion was infrequent. Now that reception of communion is normal, what role, I guess, the exchange of peace now, obviously Pope Benedict looked at this, but it seems almost to become almost a social kind of almost distraction at times during Mass. You mentioned that there was a social dimension with the passing of the Pax board. I wonder if you might comment upon the modern exchange of the sign of peace as it's done in light of the medieval, and how one might draw from the medieval to maybe influence a reform of how we offer it currently.
Yes, I mean, you certainly had that social element in the medieval exchange of peace. I mean, this Pax Breed was passed around and created a bond in the community. Also, it was hierarchically ordered, so the distinguished members of the community would be given the Pax Breed first, you know, the local aristocracy and so on. So also social order was expressed in the sharing of the peace. But yeah, it can, I mean, of course, there's more to the peace than just being a substitute for communion, but it could be regarded really as or perhaps its importance was increased at a time when very few people wouldn't ordinarily go to communion at an ordinary Sunday parish mass. It's I suppose coming from the altar, being sort of passed down from the altar, it certainly had a greater sacrality than sort of vertical or no, horizontal. I want to say exchange of peace. So I mean, there are also various other liturgical traditions, so Eastern Oriental liturgical traditions. I'm thinking of a Chaldean mass I once attended, where again the way the peace is passed down from remembered exactly. I think the priest kisses the altar, passes the priest onto his minister, and then it's passed down. So again, it's recognized as something that sort of comes from the altar, comes from Christ. So maybe that would be a way of highlighting the peace of Christ that we receive and pass on. But yes, but as I know what I'm aware of the problem you indicate, that it's often seen as disruptive. Of course, and at the time of Pope Benedict, there was a discussion about whether it should be moved to a place, so before the liturgy of the Eucharist proper begins, as it is in most other liturgical, well, probably most other historical liturgical traditions. And in fact, it's an interesting question why in the Roman Rite it's at that particular point. At the time, Pope Benedict, I think either I don't remember now, either he decided or he left the decision to Pope Francis, but certainly it was decided to leave the piece where it is. For it, because of its historical development, it's been in at that point since the 5th century. So it's not an easy question to resolve, really. But I think, there's a widespread feeling that something needs to be done about it.
Nelly?
I have a question. I've been in Hagia Sophia in Istanbul, Turkey, and I am not a religious person. I only teach catechism. And would you please give me a background or a little bit? How was Mass celebrated in that such a big mosque, Hagia Sophia? How Mass was celebrated back then?
Hagia Sophia, well, it must have been very, very, very splendid. Of course, you had, an altar in the eastern end, and some sort of a chancel screen, not a complete iconostasis. I actually don't know whether I don't think there was ever complete iconostasis installed, but certainly some form of chancel screen that was some form of visual barrier. And then the great ambo in the center. And certainly it was obviously the Byzantine Rite, which is in many ways different from the Roman Rite. But it certainly must have been, with the resources they had, the music and everything, a very, very splendid celebration there in such a beautiful setting. And after all, it made such an impact on the Kiev Rus that they thought they were in heaven when they attended Mass there, and adopted the Byzantine form of Christianity rather than the Western.
Thank you.
Father, thank you so much for rehearsing this history for us and really bringing all these things together, looking very much forward to the final product as we see it. And it's most wonderful to see a little piece of that in the latest Adoramus bulletin. During the rollout of the 2011 translation of the Roman Missal, we saw all over the place the narrative of the decay and decadence of the Roman liturgy in the medieval period, just rehearsed from what we've gotten in the early 20th century history that was done. What do you think might be the most effective aspect of the history you've put together here to change at least the perception of that common narrative in talking to parish staff, people who work in the parish, just their sense that it was just a horrible experience of ecclesial life. And now, sort of the narrative goes, we had 6 centuries of wonderful goodness, and then the utter collapse, and then Vatican II came. And here we go. What might be maybe the best rhetorical strategy based on the history you've drawn together, do you think?
Well, I think we need to communicate somehow that liturgy and participation in the liturgy is not just comprehension of language. I think that's obviously one of the great issues. Something in a language people didn't understand was removed from them, visually removed. And language is obviously important, but it's not everything. It's never exhaustive. So even with a good translation and everything, you haven't really entered into, well, the spirit of the liturgy if you remain on the level of linguistic comprehension. So the late medieval church offered this variety of vernaculars that allowed people to enter into the mystery of Christ. And that spoke to them. So that is one, I think, one aspect. So it's obviously it's sound, it's music, it's visual art, sensory experience. So I think that's one important aspect. Another aspect would be the kind of false transparency that we insist on today so much. Everything has to be visual, as you have to be able to see everything. And if you are in a church that has sort of massive pillars, you put up a TV screen and just that you just don't miss anything of what's happening at the altar. So it's a medieval cathedral, St. Patrick's Cathedral, New York. You have TV screens. So because of these barriers, which many of them have been removed historically, but we even have sort of big column pillar which obstructs the view, we've considered a problem. Hence, we need the screens. There's a kind of, as I say, false transparency, because in the end we never truly comprehend what's happening, obviously, in the liturgy, and a certain element of a certain liminal element, a barrier, threshold, which you have in the Byzantine tradition with the iconostasis, can help us to realize that. Yeah, maybe that's one way. So of entering into this conversation.
Well, dear colleagues, we have reached the end of our time, and so our final obligation is to thank Father Michael Lang for his work. So thank you so much. An announcement that this will be available, this recording, to share. We'll put it on the Society for Catholic Liturgy's website, and we'll also make sure to send it along to everyone. We invite you to join us for the next lecture in this series. Dr. Michonne Matheson on Wednesday, April 14th, will be giving a lecture on her book, Eucharistic Sacrifice and Maurice de la Taille, Does It Still Matter in Today's Church? And that will be from 3 p.m. to 4:15 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time on the 14th of April. There is the link to your right, which will include the Zoom link to register for that. And that is it. So thank you so much for being present today. And I hope that everyone has at least what is in South Bend, Indiana, a nice spring day, 60 degrees, unusual for this time of year. So enjoy your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Father Mike.
Thank you very much.